The United States only joined the First World War less than 20 months before the war ended. Even so, it still lost a number of ships, including 4 destroyers and a large collier, the USS Cyclops. The U.S. further lost several armed transports, submarine chasers, and patrol boats. However, the United States only lost 1 capital ship. At the time, capital ships were generally considered to comprise post-dreadnought battleships and battlecruisers. However, even the term capital ship is somewhat controversial and has its detractors. Nevertheless, for the purpose of this video, the only capital ship that the United States lost during World War I was the USS San Diego. This is her story, one wrapped in a mystery that endured for 100 years. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a turning point for the U.S. Navy. The fast-growing country realized it needed larger ships to protect its overseas territories and trade routes. The Pennsylvania class was its first bet in that direction. This would be a 12,000-ton armored cruiser that would be fast and able to outmaneuver enemy vessels. 6 armored cruisers of this class were approved by the U.S. Congress in 1900, with the first, the USS Pennsylvania, being laid down in 1902. Armored Cruiser No. 6, initially named USS California, was launched on April 28 and commissioned more than 3 years later on August 1, 1907. She was 503 feet 11 inches or 153.59 meters in length, with a beam 69 feet 6 inches or just over 21 meters across. For power, she steamed on 16 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, with propulsion provided by 2 vertical triple expansion reciprocating engines, allowing her to reach a respectable top speed of 22 knots, equal to 25 miles or 41 kilometers per hour. In terms of armaments, the USS California boasted 18 4 x 8-inch 203mm 40 caliber Mark V breech-loading rifles, as well as 14 of the 14 x 6-inch 152mm 50 caliber Mark VI rifles and 18 3-inch or 76mm 50 caliber rapid fire guns. This firepower was augmented by 12 3-pounder 47mm Driggs Schroeder guns and 2 1-pounder 37mm Driggs Schroeder saluting guns. She also housed 2 18-inch 450mm torpedo tubes. As for men on board, she could accommodate a complement of 80 officers, 64 Marines, and 745 enlisted sailors. The USS California was initially assigned to the Pacific Fleet, conducting training exercises and drills along California's coast before being sent to Honolulu, Hawaii in 1911. She would then visit Japan, China, and the Philippines in 1912. On September 1, 1914, just days after the outbreak of the First World War, the California was renamed the San Diego. This was done so that the ship could be in compliance with a U.S. Navy policy that reserved the names of U.S. states solely for its battleships. Newly renamed, the USS San Diego was designated as the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. Unfortunately, she would suffer her first tragedy on January 21, 1915, when she experienced an explosion in her No. 1 fire room. 5 sailors were killed in the explosion, with 7 more injured. San Diego would go on to operate as the flagship for Rear Admiral William F. Fulham in the Pacific Fleet once the United States entered the war in April 1917. She would be reassigned to the U.S. Atlantic Fleet in July of that year. She proved to be an invaluable workhorse as an escort ship to convoys on their first leg to Europe across the treacherous and U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. July 19, 1918. That was the date of the ill-fated morning for the San Diego. The cruiser was en route from Portsmouth in New Hampshire to New York City. It was well known that the waters around New England were the haunts of enemy submarines in their efforts to sink American and Allied ships. To try and counter this threat, Captain Harley H. Christie made sure that the San Diego applied a zigzagging trajectory, constantly changing direction to try and confuse would-be submarine hunters. He also posted 17 sailors as lookouts for submarines throughout the ship. All watertight doors were closed to help the boat maintain a good speed. Unfortunately, an explosion rocked the San Diego at 11:05 a.m. It had gone off on her port side below the waterline. Almost immediately, the ship started to list to her port. Worse still, all her engines had been rendered inoperable. She was taking on water rapidly, and so Captain Christie ordered the crew to abandon ship. 6 sailors lost their lives due to the explosion, but the remaining crew, totaling 1,177 men, were able to escape. They were either saved by being in lifeboats or being taken out of the water by passing ships. The following is an account of the sinking from the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships. At about 11:05 a.m. on July 19, 1918, San Diego hit a mine, the explosion sounding like a dull, heavy thud, lifting the stern slightly and shaking the ship moderately fore and aft. The warship assumed an immediate 6 to 8 degree list, and she lost headway. The mine had exploded on the port side about frame 78, well below the waterline, rupturing the skin of the ship and deforming the bulkhead at that location, opening watertight door number 142 between the port engine room and number 8 fire room. Flooding occurred in the port engine room, adjacent compartments, as well as number 8 fire room, and San Diego then took on a 17.5 degree list, water entering through an open gun port for 6-inch gun number 10. At the outset, the behavior of the ship did not convince me she was in much danger of sinking, Captain Harley H. Christie later wrote, but he soon received the report from the engineer officer that the ship had lost power in both engines. Loss of motive power precluded any maneuvering to combat a submarine. The list increased. When I was convinced that there was no hope of her holding and that she would capsize, Christie gave the order to abandon ship, the gun crews remaining at their stations until they could no longer fire, and the depth charges being secured so that they would be innocuous. San Diego's sailors launched life rafts, whaleboats, dinghies, and punts by hand, as well as mess tables, benches, hammocks, and lumber. Ample material to support the crew. An evolution performed in an orderly manner without confusion, while the broadside gun crews fired about 30 to 40 rounds at possible periscopes. With San Diego nearly on her beam ends, Captain Christie, along with his executive officer, Commander Gerard Bradford, were the last to leave the ship. Bradford went down the port side, the commanding officer went over the starboard side by a rope, swinging down to the bilge keel, then the docking keel before going overboard. Christie then watched his ship turn turtle. In a symmetrical position with the keel inclined about 10 degrees to the horizontal, the forward end elevated before gradually sinking. The USS San Diego went down between 100 and 110 feet, or between 31 and 33 meters, to the seabed. That was some 8 miles off the coast of Fire Island, a long, thin barrier island off the southern shore of Long Island in New York State. News of the sinking quickly reached the U.S. Navy, which immediately dispatched aircraft from the 1st Yale Unit to the area to try and locate any U-boats. Multiple bombs were dropped into the ocean on what was believed to be a submerged U-boat. However, all that later bobbed to the surface in the form of debris that included letters and photographs confirmed that those bombs had simply hit the already sunken USS San Diego. One U-boat spotted on several occasions in the region was U-156. It would later be reported that the commander of that German sub, Kapitänleutnant Richard Felt, had sent a wireless radio report to German Naval Command in Berlin on September 6, 1918, in which he claimed his U-boat had sunk the USS San Diego, along with other vessels in the region. By the way, that very same U-boat was credited with launching the only attack on the U.S. mainland during the war, when it hit out at several vessels just off the port of Orleans in Massachusetts. That took place on July 21, 1918, just 2 days after the San Diego had sunk. But what actually happened to the USS San Diego? Many theories abounded, with one being that a German saboteur had possibly smuggled a bomb on board which caused the explosion. Another, more obvious explanation was that it was a torpedo fired by a U-boat. However, survivors of the sinking, and we should remember that there were many of them, swore that no one saw any of the telltale bubbles and wake in the water that would usually accompany a torpedo. So what caused the San Diego to go down after that explosion? The first survey of the wreckage site was done the very year the ship sank, 1918. The first U.S. Navy dive team verified the wreckage as being that of the San Diego, and that she was lying upside down and resting on her stacks. The dive team could also ascertain where the aerial bombs had hit the San Diego that had been dropped on her by mistake by U.S. Navy aircraft. 2 later dives that year assessed that the wreck posed no threat to passing shipping. The wreck site, being fairly easy to access, became a popular dive spot. A large artificial reef also developed where the USS San Diego lies, earning the site the nickname of the Lobster Hotel. Of course, where there are divers, there is the removal of artifacts and mementos from the site. This became a headache for the U.S. Navy, given that the exact cause of the ship's sinking was still not known. Illegal salvaging by divers continued for decades, with matters coming to a head in 1992 when the Navy found out that recreational divers had recovered live ordnance from the wreck. That posed a major safety threat, and so the U.S. Coast Guard immediately established a 500-yard exclusion zone around the wreck of the USS San Diego. More protections came with the passage of the Sunken Military Craft Act of 2004. Any disturbance of sunken military property was now prohibited, but the legislation did authorize the Navy to issue permits for scientific and archaeological purposes. The mystery of what exactly sank the USS San Diego persevered, however. Finally, that changed in December 2018, more than 100 years after she had gone down. The purpose of the investigation had been to conclude which one of 3 reasons was the cause of her demise. Was it due to an enemy attack, sabotage, or an onboard accident? The report on the investigation team's findings was the culmination of a 2-year collaborative investigation between U.S. military and civilian oceanographic experts, which included side-scan sonar and underwater robots with laser imaging technology. These helped create a 3-dimensional image of the wreck. The results were presented on December 11, 2018, at the annual meeting of the American Geophysical Union in Washington, D.C. The scientific data concluded that USS San Diego was sunk by a mine laid down by the German U-boat U-156. The force of the explosion was due to the large quantities of coal on board, including 150 tons of coal stored on deck. Furthermore, the flawed design of the ship indicated that there were multiple openings in the lower compartments. These quickly filled with water after the explosion, causing the top-heavy ship to dramatically lilt almost immediately. There was nothing the crew could have done differently. And so came to an end a mystery 100 years in the making. Ironically, U-156 was itself sunk by a mine in the North Atlantic in the very same month that it caused the San Diego's sinking. However, calling that a form of karma would be a little unfair perhaps. This was war after all,